That is a book that exists.
Welcome back to episode 34 of A People's Guide to Publishing. I'm your host, Joe Beal, the autistic publisher.
And I'm Ellie Blue, the editor who doesn't care about commas.
And this week we are going to talk about everybody's least favorite subject, contracts.
Contracts! When people are publishing a book and even working for a publisher, there's a lot of romance to it. And there's a lot of hard work too. And both of those things are awesome, and I don't think anyone thinks about either of those things and is like, yeah, let's get into the contract. In fact, when we're signing new authors, we see contracts actually is kind of the part of the process that seems to cause the most anxiety, both for the authors and often for the publisher negotiating them. And we have a lot of experience with contracts. Joe has written a contract for our company that is, I think, only 2 pages long? 3?
3.
It used to be 1, now it's 3.
Yeah, we're getting corporate over here.
But sometimes friends and colleagues show us their contracts from other publishers, and there's like 12 pages or more of just like dense legal boilerplate, and
22 seems to be the average.
22, that's a little rough.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gotta be filed somewhere.
Where do they live? So it can be a little daunting, and even our 3-page contract, which is written in plain language, can be a little daunting. So we want to sort of walk you through like why contracts are important and how to tackle understanding your publishing contract as an author, and how to like come up with a good contract as a publisher that will serve both you and the author and ultimately the reader as well. Mm-hmm. Joe, can you tell us why contracts are important?
So a contract is very simple. Despite the scary language, it is really just an agreement that dictates how the relationship works.
And I've heard it said that basically, like, when you boil a publisher down to its most basic component parts, it is essentially a pile of contracts.
The value of the company is the value of the contracts, is maybe a way of putting that, is what you've heard. And that is essentially the idea being that your books are worthless if you don't have the rights to hold, sell, distribute, those books, license, etc. So most of what publishing is, honestly, is foreseeing where you have the ability to make somebody's intellectual property more valuable. So something along the lines of like, yes, conceivably, everybody could publish their own work, but, they have an audience of 20, So as a publisher, the purpose is that you have relationships with, things like audio rights holders, foreign rights translations, distribution, the ability to reach other countries with even just English language versions of the book.
And I mean, even just the very basic act of publishing something and adding it to your list and adding it to your existing sales relationships and showing it to your customers does add value, though often not as much as selling it to Hollywood to make a movie. So there was a time, right, when Microcosm did not have book contracts.
We had handshakes. So a handshake is really a contract. However, a handshake does not have a lot of clearly defined parameters as a contract does. So essentially, the way it works when you have a handshake deal is that the way that things have operated is the way that things are expected to continue to operate, up until the point where you get into gray areas that are undefined, and then nobody knows. So in our reader mailbag, we had...
Thanks for sending us mail.
Mm-hmm. We received a question this week that was essentially asking if a contract was fair. And said contract was... It was like a handshake agreement. It was very murky. It was like, if the book recoups, then we will talk about royalties or any sort of compensation for the author. The problem with that is that it does not answer any of the questions that somebody might have. So, for example, a good contract addresses the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and the most likely scenario of what will happen with that book. And so in this case, it holds the expectations very low.
Really low.
Which might not be a bad thing, but it's not a great thing. A lot of times the best thing you can do is exceed those expectations, and in this case that would not be difficult. What happens if the book does sell 1 million copies? The author's royalty is undefined. The fact that there is any compensation at all is literally undefined. And so you don't want your contract to say, in the event that this happens, we'll talk about it. Because that's kind of when everybody is at their most excited or other kinds of emotions. That's like kind of when the ego can get the best of a person.
So what would you say are like the key elements of a good contract, whether you're the one writing it or you're the one reading it?
What it governs, like the territory. I have seen contracts that are intergalactic, literally.
Awesome. That's planning for the best case scenario,
right,
or maybe the worst case scenario.
They're planning for the future, either way. So territory also covers things like format and medium. So is it just for like print book rights? Is it for digital books? Is it for audio books? Does it govern film? Does it govern like the use of the characters? Does it govern toys? Does it cover other kinds of licensing? Does it cover things like first serial publication rights, like printing it in magazines or an excerpt? Who owns the permissions to do things like that? So that's like the two kinds of territory. And then, obviously the big one is, what is everybody getting out of it? Who has to put in what time, effort, resources, and what do they get in return for that? So that is normally everything from like, what is the royalty rate for the author? What is the advance for the author? Does that advance fluctuate by scale? Like if you sell more than a certain amount, does the rate change? Does the author get free copies of the book? How many? Do they get free copies of reprints? Things like that. Just any sort of situation that could come up that people have questions about. Is the publisher responsible for all expenses? I hope so, because if not, they are not a publisher. And then the other big one is the duration of the contract. Like, how does the contract end? Does the contract expire with time? Does the book stay with the publisher as long as it's in print? That is fairly typical. Does it last for 10 years, 20 years, etc.? So you'll see all kinds of variations on these things. Like a standard contract would be negotiable, so you wouldn't have all those things set in stone. But you want all those things to be addressed one way or another. And if something is not addressed in there, that is a major red flag, because it normally either means that somebody doesn't know what they're doing, or they feel like you can just talk about it later, which in my experience is not a great time to talk about things.
And we include things like everything from like the author will turn in a book of approximately this many words or this many pages of art by this date. And we also put in things like the author will link to us, and implicit in that is not to Amazon, when they promote the book, and that the author will promote the book.
Right, doing interviews and things like that. And you do need to fairly tightly define like what is the work in question, because nobody, publisher nor author, should enter into a contract where they essentially own all rights to everything the author does, because essentially what happens when the publisher isn't interested in something the author has made, and it has to live in limbo while it can't be seen in the world.
Or what if the author hates working with the publisher?
Or vice versa.
Vice versa, I know, right? Yeah. So like that is everything from like the working title to like, I would say a 1 or 2 sentence description of the proposed work. And then that way, like if the author decides like, I have a contract with Microcosm to like write a history of green buildings in Portland, but I hate working with them, so I'm going to take my history of green buildings in Portland to Simon & Schuster. Like, they can't do that. We have the contract, and we would have a very awkward conversation with Simon & Schuster. But that means they would probably buy the rights from us, or they would run away screaming. Contracts should always offer both the publisher and the author an out.
Like a way to end it.
And can you talk more about, like, what are reasonable, because you don't, like, the contract doesn't make any sense if anyone can just walk away at any time for any reason. But you do need to like protect both parties from each other and from like bad luck.
And just like bad behavior of somebody else's incompetence, negligence, or just misfortune. And so, we've had it many times where an author tells us that they wrote something that they did not write, or an author owns the rights to something that they do not. and the person that actually created it normally does eventually find us and thinks that it was our malfeasance or dishonesty or what have you. And that's a plenty awkward conversation. Theoretically, we could be held liable, so we shift that liability in the contract to the author to, if they are selling us something, they have to represent at least the responsibility if that does not turn out to be true. Plenty of situations happen where somebody is unhappy. And so we have a clause now where I think it's after, if the author is unhappy after 5 years, then they can purchase any remaining stock at cost and terminate the contract, and that is way better for everybody if, they're unhappy. And, if they think they can have a better go at it elsewhere, so be it. Maybe they can, maybe they can't, but that isn't our concern, because essentially if they're unhappy, they're often not going to be treating us well. Maybe they don't understand what industry norms are, so they don't understand that the average book sells 2,000 copies, so they don't understand that their book that sold 3,500 is actually in a high percentile. So maybe they think that we're not doing a very good job, and maybe we want out of that contract. So a lot of times what we'll do is say, okay, well, when this book sells out, we just won't reprint and we'll let the rights revert and call it a day, because we're not able to get anything else out of this. And if somebody else can, great. Sometimes the way some people treat you, it's nothing is worth that, That's you really have to draw the line somewhere for just people that are really being grating or worse, So if you approach it that way and, use the contract negotiation period as a getting to know you sort of period, you can get a pretty good sense of how somebody operates. And in hindsight, there's a lot of people we did work with that, looking at that, how they behave during the contract negotiation, I would not have worked with them today, knowing what I know now.
I feel like another red flag, weirdly enough, is somebody who just takes the contract and signs it without reading it.
Terrible. Yep.
Yeah, that is usually pretty dangerous, because then they don't know what's in it. They haven't thought about it. I would much rather have the call from the person's lawyer, which, that's another, I guess that's our final topic. But I would much rather kind of have protracted hours-long conversations over weeks about what's in the contract than I would have somebody not read it, sign it, and then be unhappy later about what they signed on to.
And that is it's unbelievably common where somebody signs it faster than they could have read it. Or worse, then they come back weeks, months later, and they're like, oh, I thought this would be how this worked.
Or then they demand, they're like, actually, you should pay me a different amount, or you should give me more free books than in the contract. And we're like, well, that's...
Right.
I guess, oh man, there's so many topics I want to talk about, but I feel like we shouldn't go on for too long more about this. We can have more podcasts about contracts. It's such a fun topic. But I guess, the final thing I want to kind of say is if you want help understanding your contract or making sure you're offering a good contract as a publisher, do you advise hiring a lawyer? How do you advise going about this?
If you are an author or you are a novice publisher, hiring an entertainment lawyer is not going to be great. It's like kind of hiring a CPA to do your taxes, where they will think of every single possible thing that can go wrong rather than what is very likely to happen, and they're going to put little bugs in your ear that'll make you worry about things that aren't actually a problem. So what I would do as an author, if you have a contract and you don't know how to make sense of it, talk to somebody else who is an author who is a little more successful and ask them, what is standard, what is normal, what is acceptable. Or, if you're a publisher or an author, asking a publisher similar kinds of questions, what are you agreeing to? What do these words mean? Is this, is 10% net royalties on a hardcover normal? Is it high? Is it low? Things like that. And there's a whole chapter about it in A People's Guide to Publishing, the book. So you can go much, much deeper there.
And I think the Authors Guild may also be able to help you.
If you're a member.
If you're a member. Yeah. You can find us on the internet at microcosmpublishing.com or microcosm.pub if you want to keep it short and simple. You can also find us on Twitter at microcosm, on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing, on Instagram at microcosm_pub, and here in Portland on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.